The dust of the Dakota Territory tells no lies. It clings to the righteous and the damned all the same, a fine red powder that chokes out secrets and buries bones. For a man like Jacob Blackwood, they called him Hawk, for how he saw things others missed. The dust was a language. But the woman he found, half swallowed by that unforgiving earth, spoke a different tongue entirely, one of fear. He offered her water, a moment's peace. But when she flinched from his touch, her voice, a raw scrape, she whispered the words that would ignite a firestorm across the plains. "I'm not clean." The sun was a merciless hammer against the anvil of the earth. It beat down on the cracked soil and sparse buffalo grass of the Dakota plains, warping the air into a shimmering haze that made the distant black hills tremble. Jacob Hawk Blackwood rode through this furnace, his posture relaxed in the saddle, a stark contrast to the coiled readiness that lived perpetually in his muscles. He was a man of two worlds, belonging fully to neither. He had the sharp, high cheekbones and raven-black hair of his mother's people, but his eyes were a startling grey, a legacy from the fur trapper father he'd barely known. He wore settler's clothes, durable canvas trousers, and a dusty leather vest over a plain cotton shirt, but moved with an innate silence that spoke of a different upbringing. He was tracking a man named Finch, a low-rate outlaw with a high price on his head for robbing a stagecoach and killing a guard. The trail was 2 days old, but Hawk was patient. He read the land like a book, a displaced stone, a broken twig, the depth of a hoofprint in the baked earth. It all told a story. Finch was clumsy, desperate, and heading west, likely for the lawless mining camps where a man could disappear. It was the unnatural stillness that first alerted him. A patch of ground ahead, just off the faint game trail he was following, was disturbed. But it wasn't the heavy, careless tracks of a man like Finch. These were shallower, erratic signs of a struggle against exhaustion rather than a flight from justice. He dismounted from his buckskin mare, sundown, the leather of his saddle creaking in the profound silence. He moved forward, his rifle held loosely in one hand, his grey eyes scanning every shadow, every rock. There, slumped against a cluster of sagebrush, whose grey-green leaves offered pitiful shade, was a figure. It was a woman. Her dress, once a respectable shade of blue, was torn, filthy, and stained dark in several places. Her bonnet was gone, and her honey-blonde hair was a matted tangle caked with dust and sweat. One of her arms was wrapped in a crude bandage made from a strip of her own petticoat, and it was seeped through with blood. Hawk approached with the caution of a wolf. The West was full of traps, and a woman in distress could be the most dangerous kind of bait. He circled his steps, making no sound on the hard-packed dirt. He saw no one else, heard nothing but the buzz of a fly and the whisper of the hot wind. Her breathing was shallow, a faint rasp in her throat. Her face, turned away from him, was pale beneath the grime, her lips cracked and bloodless. He knelt, his rifle resting across his knees. "Mum," he said, his voice low and calm, careful not to startle her. There was no response. He reached out and gently touched her shoulder. Her skin was fever-hot. She stirred at his touch, a pained whimper escaping her lips. Her head lolled toward him, and her eyes fluttered open. They were the color of a summer sky, but clouded with pain and disorientation. She saw him, a tall, dark figure, looming over her, and a spark of pure terror lit them up. She tried to scramble back, a pathetic, weak motion that barely moved her an inch. "Easy," Hawk said, holding his hands up, palms open. "I'm not going to hurt you. You need water." He uncorked his canteen. The sound of the sloshing water made her eyes fix on it with a desperate intensity. He brought it to her lips, tilting it slowly. She drank greedy and clumsy water, spilling down her chin and onto the bodice of her ruined dress. When she had taken a few desperate swallows, he pulled it away gently. Slowly. Too much at once will make you sick. She coughed, her body racked with tremors. She stared at him, her fear warring with the primal need for survival. Who are you?" she rasped. "Name's Jacob Blackwood. Folks call me Hawk." He looked at her arm. "What happened to you?" Her gaze darted around the empty plains, as if expecting an attacker to materialize from the shimmering heat. "My wagon. It broke an axle. My husband, he went for help. Days ago." The lie was thin, unpracticed. There were no wagon tracks for miles, and her wounds were not from a simple accident. The gash on her arm looked like a defensive wound, and the dark bruises blooming on her cheekbone were shaped like knuckles. Hawk didn't call her on it. A story, even a bad one, was a shield. "Where were you headed?" "To Redemption Creek," she whispered, her eyes pleading with him to believe her. Redemption. Creek was a day's ride north, a hard-scrabble town clinging to life on the edge of the Badlands. "You're a long way off course," he said, his voice neutral. He knew she was running, not lost, and people who ran this hard were either running from the law or from something much, much worse. Finch and his bounty were forgotten. A new story had just begun, one written in blood and desperation on the open page of the prairie. He tore a clean strip from his spare shirt in his saddlebag and fetched his small medical pouch. It held little more than some carbolic salve and clean linen, but it was better than the filth-caked rag on her arm. As he reached for her, she flinched violently away from him, pressing herself against the sagebrush. "Don't!" she breathed, her voice shaking. "Please, don't touch me." "Your wound needs cleaning," he said patiently. "It'll fester in this heat." "No," she insisted, her eyes wide, with a terror that went beyond her immediate situation. A strange, profound shame radiated from her. "You can't. I'm not clean." The words hung in the oppressive heat. It was a bizarre statement. Of course she wasn't clean. She'd been lying in the dirt for who knew how long. But the way she said it, the whisper that was part confession, part plea, spoke of a different kind of impurity. It was a stain on her soul, not just her skin. Hawk's sharp eyes, accustomed to seeing the truth of a trail, now saw the truth of a spirit. This woman wasn't just wounded. She was broken, and as he looked at her, this fragile piece of humanity, lost in the vast, indifferent wilderness, the hardened bounty hunter felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time, a dangerous, unwelcome stirring of compassion. He had to know what kind of filth could make a person so afraid of a simple helping hand. Hawk made a decision. Leaving her here was a death sentence, and turning her over to whatever was in Redemption Creek felt like a betrayal of some unspoken code. The bounty on Finch could wait. He lifted the woman with a gentleness that belied his strength. She was lighter than a sack of flour and barely conscious, her brief flash of terrified energy spent. She didn't protest as he settled her in front of him on sundown, her head lolling against his chest. As he guided the horse north away from Finch's trail, he felt the fever radiating from her body and knew he had little time. Instead of riding directly for Redemption Creek, he veered east towards a line of low-lying hills. Tucked away in a small hidden valley was an old line shack, abandoned years ago by prospectors. It was little more than 4 decaying walls and a roof, but it offered shelter from the sun and prying eyes. It was a place he used on occasion, a waypoint between the worlds he navigated. He reached it as the sun began its descent, painting the sky in violent streaks of orange and purple. Inside the cabin was sparse. A stone hearth, a rickety table, and a built-in bunk filled with old dry straw. He laid her down on the bunk, covering her with his bedroll. She was shivering now, the fever taking full hold. For the next 2 days, Hawk became a reluctant nursemaid. He hunted a jackrabbit for broth, which he patiently spooned between her cracked lips. He found wild mint and yarrow root by the small creek that trickled through the valley, brewing them into a tea to fight the fever. He cleaned and dressed the wound on her arm, which was deep and inflamed but free of gangrene, a small miracle. She drifted in and out of consciousness, muttering fragmented, fearful phrases in her delirium. Names he didn't know, places he couldn't picture. But one name came up more than others, a low, guttural curse whispered in her sleep. Cain. During her lucid moments, she was silent and watchful, her sky-blue eyes tracking his every move. She ate what he gave her, drank the tea, but refused to speak. A wall of fear and shame stood between them, thicker than the log walls of the cabin. Hawk didn't push. He understood the language of silence. He simply moved about the small space with a quiet efficiency, cleaning his rifle, mending a tear in his leather vest, sitting by the fire at night, and watching the flames dance. On the 3rd evening, the fever broke. She woke to find him sitting at the table, sharpening his knife by the light of a single candle. The cabin was filled with the smell of wood smoke and roasting meat. She pushed herself up on one elbow, her head clear for the first time in days. "You're awake," he stated, not looking up from his task. The rhythmic scrape of steel on stone was a soothing sound. "Yes," she said, her voice weak but steady. "Thank you. You saved my life." "You're tougher than you look," he replied, finally meeting her gaze. His grey eyes were unreadable. "What's your name?" She hesitated for a long moment. "Rosalind," she finally said. "Rosalind Thorne." "Rosalind," he repeated, testing the sound of it. "I need to change that bandage." The old fear returned to her eyes. She instinctively pulled the blanket tighter around herself. Hawk sighed, putting down his knife and stone. He moved to the hearth and brought back a small pot of warm water and a clean strip of linen. "I won't hurt you," he said, his voice softer than she'd heard it before. "But that wound is my doing now. I aim to see it heal properly." Something in his tone, a sense of quiet ownership over her well-being, seemed to breach her defenses. She watched him, her expression, a mixture of apprehension and a desperate yearning for kindness. Slowly, hesitantly, she extended her injured arm. He knelt beside the bunk, his movements deliberate and sure. He carefully unwrapped the old bandage. The skin around the gash was still red and angry, but the swelling had gone down. As he began to gently clean the wound with the warm water, his knuckles brushed against the soft skin of her inner arm. Rosalind flinched, as if she'd been struck. A choked sob escaped her throat, and she yanked her arm back, cradling it to her chest. Tears welled in her eyes, spilling down her pale cheeks. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her whole body trembling. "I'm so sorry. I can't." Hawk remained kneeling, his hands resting on his knees. He waited his patience, a tangible thing in the small firelit cabin. "Can't what, Rosalind? I told you." She whispered the words, ragged and torn from her throat, as she rocked back and forth. "I'm not clean." There it was again. That strange, desperate phrase. It wasn't about the dirt or the grime. He understood that now. It was something deeper, a poison in her soul. "What does that mean?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. She shook her head, her blonde hair falling across her face. "You wouldn't understand. No decent person would. He marked me. He made me unclean, so no one else would ever want me. So I would always be his." The words were cryptic, chilling. Marked her. Like livestock, the air in the cabin grew thick, heavy with her unspoken horror. Hawk's mind, trained to solve puzzles, and see the unseen worked furiously. He had seen brands on cattle on horses. He had seen the scars of whips and knives on men. But this was something different. This was a wound she carried on the inside, a shame so profound she couldn't bear the simplest human touch. He reached out again, not for her arm, but for her hand. He stopped just short of touching her, his calloused fingers hovering over her trembling ones. "Rosalind," he said, and his voice held a command that was not unkind. "Let me see." It wasn't the wound on her arm he was asking about. They both knew it. He was asking to see the source of her shame, the mark she spoke of. He was asking her to trust him with the very thing that had shattered her. She looked from his hovering hand to his steady, grey eyes. In their depths, she did not see judgment or disgust. She saw only a quiet, unwavering intensity. She saw a man who was not afraid of the dark. For the first time since she'd fled into the wilderness, a tiny, fragile seed of trust began to sprout in the barren wasteland of her heart. Her breathing hitched. Her tears subsided, replaced by a stark, terrifying resolve. She slowly uncurled from her defensive ball. Her hand went to the collar of her dress, to the small row of buttons at her shoulder. Her fingers fumbled, shaking too much to perform the simple task. Hawk remained perfectly still, waiting. This was her choice. Her confession. He would not force it. He would only bear witness. While Rosalind wrestled with her demons in the secluded cabin, the world outside continued its relentless march. Hawk knew they couldn't stay hidden forever. Their supplies were dwindling, and Rosalind, though her fever was gone, was still weak. She needed proper food and rest. More than that, Hawk needed information. He needed to know who Cain was and how far his reach extended. Leaving Rosalind with a small pistol, he kept for emergencies an act of trust that made her eyes widen, and enough food and water for 2 days. He rode for Redemption Creek. He entered the town not as a man hiding something, but as he always did, a quiet observer on the edge of things. Redemption Creek was like a dozen other towns he'd seen. It was one dusty main street, bracketed by a saloon, a general store, a blacksmith, and a sheriff's office that looked more like a glorified closet. The air was thick with the smell of manure, cheap whiskey, and desperation. He tied sundown outside the general store and went inside. The proprietor, a balding man with a stained apron named Peterson, gave him a cursory nod. Hawk bought coffee bacon and flour, the mundane essentials of life. As Peterson weighed out the beans, Hawk leaned against the counter, casual. "Quiet day," Hawk remarked. "Too quiet," Peterson grumbled. "Quiet means no one's spending money, except for them." He jerked his chin toward the saloon across the street. 3 horses were tied to the hitching post, all of them fine animals, much better stock than the usual sway-backed nags seen in town. Their saddles were new leather, stamped with the same insignia, a stylized K intertwined with a crown. "Newcomers?" Hawk asked, his voice betraying no particular interest. "Been here 2 days," Peterson said, lowering his voice. "Rode in from the south. Men who work for Bartholomew Cain. You heard of him." Hawk's blood ran cold, but his expression remained impassive. "The cattle baron owns most of the land, down by the White River, they say. Owns the land, the water, and most of the men on it," Peterson corrected. "These 3 are asking questions, looking for something he's misplaced." He leaned closer, the scent of stale tobacco on his breath. "They're looking for a woman. His wife. Say she ran off." Hawk's mind flashed to Rosalind's terrified eyes. "He made me unclean, so I would always be his." It was starting to make a horrifying kind of sense. "That so," Hawk said, paying for his goods. "Lot of trouble for one woman." "Not just any woman," Peterson whispered, his eyes gleaming with second-hand gossip. They say she's a real beauty, Kane's prized possession. He's offering a reward. $500. Enough to make a man forget his conscience. $500. It was more than the bounty on a dozen outlaws like Finch. It was enough to set a man up for a year. Hawk gave a non-committal grunt, took his supplies and left the store. The sun seemed harsher now, the dust of the street more menacing. Kane's shadow stretched all the way to this god-forsaken town. He walked toward the sheriff's office. He needed to know what the law was doing. The sheriff was a man named Elias Vance, a veteran of the war with a weary face and a perpetual slump to his shoulders. He was an honest man in a place where honesty was often a liability. Vance was at his desk, staring into a mug of what looked like tar. He looked up as Hawk entered the bell above the door, giving a feeble jingle. "Blackwood," Vance said, his tone tired. "Don't tell me you've brought another body in. My paperwork's already a week behind." "Just passing through, Sheriff. Heard you had visitors?" Vance sighed, running a hand over his face. "Kane's men. A bull-necked bastard named Cortland and his two shadows. They're turning my town into their personal saloon, flashing Kane's money and asking about his wife. Got a poster." He gestured to a freshly printed notice on the wall. Hawk walked over to it. It was a crude drawing, but the likeness was unmistakable. The honey-blonde hair, the sky-blue eyes. It was Rosalind. The text described her as Rosalind Kane, beloved wife of Bartholomew Kane, and stated she had wandered off in a state of confusion and ill health. It warned that she was fragile and should be returned to her husband's care immediately. A reward of $500 was offered for her safe return. It was a masterpiece of manipulative prose, painting Kane as a concerned husband and Rosalind as a delicate, unstable creature. "Seems straightforward enough," Hawk said, turning back to the sheriff. "Straightforward as a rattler's strike." Vance scoffed. "I've heard stories about Kane, the kind of stories men only tell after the third bottle of whiskey. They say he's not a man you cross, and he treats everything he owns, land, cattle, people, the same way. He brands it." The word hit Hawk like a physical blow. He thought of the revulsion in Rosalind's voice. He marked me. He thought of her terror at his simple touch. The puzzle pieces were slotting together, and the picture they were forming was monstrous. "This Cortland," Hawk asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "What's your read on him?" "He's a wolf on a leash," Vance said grimly. "And Kane holds the leash. He'd burn this town to the ground if he thought it would get him what he wants. I've told him this is my jurisdiction, but that's a joke. Kane's money is the only law that matters out here. If you see this woman Blackwood, my official advice is to turn her in. Collect the money and walk away." Vance leaned forward, his eyes boring into Hawk's. "My personal advice, run. Run as far and as fast as you can, and pray they never find you." Hawk gave a slow nod. "Appreciate the honesty, Sheriff." He walked out of the office and into the glare of the afternoon sun. Across the street, the batwing doors of the saloon swung open, and a man stepped out. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a cruel slash of a mouth and cold, dead eyes. He wore a fine coat and two ivory-handled pistols tied low on his hips. He scanned the street with an air of arrogant ownership. This had to be Cortland. Their eyes met for a brief, challenging second. Hawk saw a flicker of professional assessment in the gunslinger's gaze, a sizing up of a potential threat. Then Cortland dismissed him, turning back into the saloon. Hawk felt the weight of the $500 reward. It was a fortune. But as he untied Sundown and swung into the saddle, he knew it might as well have been 5 cents. This was no longer about a lost woman or a bounty. It was about the shadow of a man named Kane, a man who branded what he owned. He urged sundown into a canter, leaving Redemption Creek and its poisoned promises behind. He was riding back to the cabin, back to Rosalind. He was riding back to learn the true, terrible meaning of the words, "I'm not clean." The ride back to the Hidden Valley was fraught with a new tension. The landscape, which had before been a familiar tapestry of challenges and signs, now seemed to hold threats in every shadow. Every gust of wind sounded like the hoofbeats of Cortland's men. Hawk pushed sundown harder than he normally would, an urgency coiling in his gut. The conversation with Sheriff Vance and the sight of the bounty poster had transformed Rosalind from a mystery into a target. And he, by sheltering her, had painted a target on his own back. He found the cabin as he had left it, a silent refuge tucked into the hillside. Rosalind was sitting on the edge of the bunk when he entered, the pistol he'd left her resting on her lap. She looked up, her expression a mixture of profound relief and gnawing anxiety. "You came back," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I said I would," he replied, setting down his supplies. He didn't tell her about Redemption Creek, about Cortland, about the poster with her face on it. Not yet. The fear in her eyes was already a constant simmering thing. He didn't need to add fuel to it until he had to. That evening, a fragile peace settled between them. Hawk cooked bacon and brewed fresh coffee, and the simple domesticity of the act felt strangely intimate in the rustic cabin. They ate in silence, but it was a different kind of silence than before. It was less about suspicion and more about a shared, unspoken understanding of the danger that lay just beyond their sanctuary. After they had eaten, Rosalind sat huddled in her blanket by the fire, even though the night was warm. The flames cast dancing shadows on the log walls, making the small space feel like the only safe place in the world. Hawk sat at the table, cleaning his weapons with meticulous care, the soft clicks and scrapes of metal a counterpoint to the crackling fire. "My real name isn't Thorn," she said suddenly, her voice so soft he almost didn't hear it. "It was my mother's name. I took it when I ran." Hawk paused his work, looking at her. "What is it then?" "It doesn't matter," she said, shaking her head. "It was his name. It belongs to him. I left it behind." He accepted that, giving a slow nod before returning to his work. He was giving her space, letting her offer up pieces of her story at her own pace. He knew she was circling the truth like a nervous deer approaching a watering hole. Finally, she took a shuddering breath. "You asked me what I meant. When I said what I said. Hawk carefully set down the pistol cylinder he was oiling. He turned his full attention to her. "I did. I think I have to show you," she said, her voice trembling. "So you'll understand. So you'll know why you should just leave me. Why you should take me to the sheriff and collect your money." The mention of the money sent a jolt through him. "You know about the reward?" She gave a bitter, humorless laugh. "Of course there's a reward. I am his most prized property. He would pay handsomely to have me returned." She looked at him, her blue eyes dark with a sorrow so deep it seemed bottomless. $500, isn't it? That's his usual price for a prize bull." The callous comparison made Hawk's jaw tighten. He said nothing, his silence a question. With a resolve that seemed to cost her everything, Rosalind stood up. She turned her back to him, facing the stone hearth. The firelight flickered across her silhouette. "He did this a year ago," she whispered, her voice cracking. "After a ranch, Hand was kind to me. Offered me a wildflower he'd picked. Bartholomew saw it. He called it an act of defiance. He said I needed a permanent reminder of who I belonged to. He said that if my face was for the world, My body was for him alone, and he would put his mark on it where only he could see it. Her hands, shaking uncontrollably, went to the buttons at the back of her neck. She couldn't manage them. After a moment of futile struggle, she let out a sound of pure frustration and despair. Hawk rose from the table. He moved behind her, his presence a large, warm shadow. He could feel the tremors running through her body. He stopped a foot away, not touching her. "May I?" he asked, his voice a low gravel. She gave a single jerky nod. His fingers, surprisingly nimble for a man of his size and profession, went to the small pearl buttons. He worked them free, one by one, his touch impossibly light. As each button was released, the rough fabric of her dress parted. He pulled the collar of her dress and the thin cotton chemise beneath it, down, exposing her right shoulder and the top of her back to the flickering firelight. And then he saw it. His breath caught in his throat. His heart, a steady drum that had beaten calmly through gunfights and blizzards, stopped. For one long, silent second, it simply ceased to beat. There seared into the pale, smooth skin below her shoulder blade was a brand. It was not a crude mark, but an intricate, horribly elegant design. It was the stylized K, intertwined with a crown he had seen on the saddles in town. The scar tissue was old, a pale, puckered testament to an agony he could barely comprehend. It was a mark of ownership, a brand burned into human flesh as if she were no more than an animal. A piece of livestock. "I'm not clean," she whispered. And when the cloth dropped, the Lakota warrior's heart stopped. It wasn't disgust that seized him. It wasn't pity. It was a rage so pure and so cold it felt like ice in his veins. It was a white-hot fury that eclipsed everything else, the bounty, the danger, the caution that had kept him alive for 30 years. In that instant, every choice was made clear. This was not about a woman running from a cruel husband. This was about a monster who dared to scar another human being like cattle. This was about an evil so profound it had to be met and destroyed. He saw the shame that radiated from her the way she hunched her shoulders as if to hide the unforgivable mark. He saw the years she must have lived with this secret horror, this physical proof of her subjugation. Slowly, deliberately, he reached out his hand. He didn't touch the brand. Instead, he gently laid his palm on the unscarred skin of her other shoulder. His touch was firm, warm, and steady. It was not a touch of possession or of pity. It was a touch of acknowledgement of solidarity. Rosalind flinched, a gasp escaping her lips. But she didn't pull away. She stood frozen, a statue of past pain and present fear. She had expected revulsion, horror, perhaps even a cruel form of pity. She had not expected this quiet, grounding act of acceptance. "This," Hawk said, his voice a low, dangerous growl that vibrated through her bones, "is not your shame, Rosalind. It is his." He gently pulled the fabric of her dress back up, covering the monstrous proof of Bartholomew Kane's evil. But it was too late. He had seen it. He could never unsee it. The brand was seared into his mind as surely as it was seared into her skin. And in the heart of the man they called Hawk, a bounty was cancelled and a vow was made. Bartholomew Kane would pay. The revelation of the brand changed everything. The cabin was no longer a sanctuary, it was a temporary hiding place. Hawk was no longer a reluctant protector. He was an instrument of a reckoning that had been a long time coming. He now understood the depth of Rosalind's fear and the true nature of the man who hunted her. Bartholomew Kane was not just a cruel husband. He was a tyrant who believed his power gave him the right to unmake a person, to turn them into an object. "We can't stay here," Hawk said the next morning, his voice stripped of all warmth, honed to a fine, sharp edge. His man Cortland is in Redemption Creek. They'll start searching the surrounding area soon. They'll find this place. Rosalind, who had barely slept, looked up at him. The shame in her eyes had been replaced by a flicker of something new. Seeing her deepest secret had not made him abandon her. It had forged a bond between them, solid and unbreakable. Where will we go? He has men everywhere. We don't run, Hawk said. The idea had formed in his mind during the long, dark hours of the night, a cold, clear plan. Running is what he expects. He'll hunt you forever. We have to stop him. Not just his men. Him. The audacity of the statement hung in the air. A woman with a branded shoulder and a half-blood bounty hunter against the most powerful cattle baron in the territory. It was madness. But as Rosalind looked at the unwavering resolve in Hawk's grey eyes, it felt like the only sane option left. First, Hawk continued, "We need to remove the wolf from the flock. Cortland. As long as he's in that town, he's a threat to us, and to anyone who might help us." His plan was simple and lethally dangerous. He would go back to Redemption Creek. But this time he wouldn't be an observer. He left Rosalind hidden in a more defensible position, a small rocky overhang higher up in the hills, overlooking the trail to the cabin with his rifle and clear instructions not to show herself for any reason. He rode into town in the late afternoon, when the sun was low and the shadows were long. He hitched Sundown, not outside the saloon, but further down the street near the blacksmith's forge. He didn't want the horse to be a target. He walked into the saloon. The place was thicker with smoke and tension than it had been the day before. Cortland and his 2 men were at a corner table drinking whiskey. Cortland was facing the door. His chair tilted back against the wall, his coat open to show the ivory-handled pistols. He was holding his voice, a low, confident drawl that cut through the nervous murmur of the local patrons. He saw Hawk enter, and a flicker of recognition, and then dismissal crossed his face. To him, Hawk was just another drifter. Hawk walked to the bar and ordered a whiskey. He didn't look at Cortland's table. He sipped the raw liquor, letting its burn settle in his stomach, and listened, and the boss says 500 for the woman and another 100 for the scalp of anyone who helps her. Cortland was saying loud enough for the whole room to hear. So if any of you fine citizens see a pretty little blonde with sad eyes, you'll know what to do. He laughed a harsh, ugly sound. Hawk finished his drink, setting the glass down on the bar with a quiet click. He turned around, leaning his elbows back against the bar, and surveyed the room. His gaze eventually settled on Cortland. That reward, Hawk said his voice, calm and carrying. Does it come with a condition? Cortland stopped talking. The room went silent. Every eye turned to Hawk. Cortland slowly brought his chair forward, its legs thudding on the wooden floor. "What did you say?" Cortland asked, his voice soft and menacing. "The condition?" Hawk repeated, his grey eyes locked on the gunman. "Does she have to be alive?" A slow, cruel smile spread across Cortland's face. He thought he understood. He thought this was a negotiation. For 500, the boss wants her back, breathing. But he's a reasonable man. If she proves difficult, I'm sure he'd settle for proof of the find. "Why, you know something, I know she passed this way," Hawk lied, his voice a smooth, convincing drawl. "Saw tracks, a woman alone on foot, heading into the Badlands north of here. But the Badlands are hard country. She might not make it out." Cortland's eyes narrowed. He was hooked. The Badlands were a maze of canyons and dead ends, a perfect place for a desperate woman to get lost. "Show me," Cortland commanded, standing up. His 2 men stood with him. "Just you," Hawk said, not moving from his spot. "Too many riders will scare her off, make her go deeper in. You and me. We find her. We split the reward. 600 if we have to bring back just the proof. He let the ugly word hang in the air. Cortland studied him. Hawk looked like any other bounty man, hard capable and motivated by money. The greed in Cortland's eyes overrode his caution. Splitting 500 was better than nothing, and if he could get the information and then eliminate his partner, he'd have it all. All right, Drifter Cortland sneered. My boys will wait here. You and me, we'll take a ride. Sheriff Vance, who had been watching the entire exchange from a table in the back, felt a cold dread creep up his spine. He knew Blackwood was no fool. This wasn't about money. This was a death sentence being delivered, but he wasn't sure for whom. Hawk led Cortland out of town, heading north. As soon as they were out of sight of Redemption Creek, winding their way through a series of rocky arroyos, Hawk reined Sundown to a halt. The trail starts here, he said, dismounting. It's faint. Have to go on foot. Cortland dismounted as well, his hand hovering near his pistol. He was a creature of towns and saloons, not the wilderness. Out here, the power dynamic had already begun to shift. He followed Hawk into a narrow wash, the rock walls rising on either side. I don't see any damn tracks, Cortland growled, his eyes scanning the ground. That's because you don't know how to look. Hawk said, his back still to the gunman. He pointed to a scuff mark on a rock. She came through here, slipped. As Cortland bent forward to look, his focus diverted for a single fatal second. Hawk moved. He didn't draw his gun. That would have been an even fight. This wasn't about being even. This was about eradication. He spun, not with a weapon, but with the heavy, sharpened throwing knife he kept sheathed in the small of his back. The motion was a blur of speed and deadly grace. The knife left his hand and flew through the 10 feet of air separating them, silent and true. Cortland looked up from the rock, his hand just starting to move toward his ivory-handled pistol, a curse forming on his lips. He never finished it. The knife took him in the throat, sinking to the hilt with a sickening thud. His eyes went wide with shock and disbelief. He gargled a red foam spilling from his mouth and clawed at the handle of the knife before collapsing into the dust, his own blood pooling around him. Hawk walked over to the body. He felt no remorse, no triumph, only the cold satisfaction of a necessary task completed. He retrieved his knife, wiping it clean on the dead man's vest. He knew Cortland's men would come looking when their boss didn't return. He had bought himself and Rosalind a little more time, but he had also declared war. He rode back to the overhang, not as a bounty hunter, but as a warrior. The first blow had been struck. Now he had to face the king. The absence of Cortland and the subsequent panicked departure of his 2 henchmen from Redemption Creek bought Hawk and Rosalind precious time. They didn't wait for Kane's main force to arrive. Instead, they moved deeper into the Badlands, a place Hawk knew as well as the lines on his own hand. It was a brutal, beautiful landscape of towering rock formations, deep canyons, and hidden springs, a natural fortress for those who understood its secrets. During these days of travel, a profound change occurred in Rosalind. The constant hunted fear began to recede, replaced by a quiet, steely resolve. She was no longer just a victim. Watching Hawk, seeing his unwavering commitment and lethal competence had ignited something within her. She learned to load and fire the rifle, her hands steady her aim, improving with each practice shot. She learned to read the signs of the trail to find water, to move silently through the treacherous terrain. She was shedding the identity of Rosalind Kane, the prized possession, and rediscovering the woman she was before him. "He will come himself," she said one evening, as they sat by a small, smokeless fire in a well-hidden cave. "He won't trust anyone else now. When something is his, he is the only one who can retrieve it, or destroy it. I'm counting on it. Hawk replied, his face grim in the firelight. "We fight him here, on our ground." His plan was a deadly gamble. He knew Cain would bring a small army, convinced that overwhelming force was the solution to any problem. But an army was useless in the twisting confines of the Badlands. Here, a few well-placed individuals could hold off dozens. It would be a battle of knowledge and cunning against brute force and arrogance. A week later, a scout hawk had positioned on a high mesa signaled him. A dust cloud was rising from the south, a large party of riders. It was Cain. Hawk and Rosalind moved into the heart of their chosen battlefield, a labyrinthine canyon known to the old prospectors as Whisperwind Pass. It was a maze of narrow passages, blind alleys and high ledges, where the wind moaned with an eerie human-like sound. Bartholomew Cain rode at the head of 20 men. He was a large, imposing figure with a face like a clenched fist and eyes that held the flat, cold cruelty of a snake's. He was dressed in expensive tailored riding clothes that were already coated in a fine layer of dust, a testament to his impatience. He radiated an aura of absolute ownership, of a man who had never been denied anything in his life. The loss of his wife was not a heartbreak. It was an intolerable insult to his power. He led his men into the mouth of Whisperwind Pass, arrogant and certain. The tracks were clear, leading them directly into his trap. The first sign that something was wrong came when a massive boulder, dislodged from a high ledge, crashed down onto the trail, blocking their path of retreat and spooking of the horses. Panic rippled through the men. Before they could recover, the attack began. It was not a charge or a volley. It was a symphony of chaos conducted by Hawk. A single shot from a high ridge would send a ricochet whining through the canyon, sowing confusion. A carefully placed arrow, Hawk's preferred silent weapon, would take down a man at the rear of the column without a sound. He moved like a ghost along the canyon walls, using the echoes and the wind to disguise his position, making one rifle sound like three. Cain's men, accustomed to open plains combat, were terrified. They were firing at shadows at the screech of the wind, their bullets sparking harmlessly off the canyon walls. They were being hunted, picked off one by an enemy they could not see. Rosalind played her part. From her own concealed position, she was not a primary shooter. Her role was strategic. She used a large piece of polished metal to flash the sun into the eyes of men, taking aim, momentarily blinding them. She rolled smaller rocks down scree slopes, creating diversions that drew fire and allowed Hawk to reposition. She was not the damsel in the tower. She was a warrior defending her newfound freedom. She saw one of Cain's men spot Hawk's position, and without hesitation, she raised the rifle sighted down the barrel and fired. The man cried out and tumbled from his saddle. A wave of nausea and adrenaline washed over her, but it was followed by a fierce, undeniable sense of empowerment. She was fighting back. The canyon became a tomb. Over the course of 2 hours, Cain's force was whittled down, their numbers and superior firepower rendered useless by terror and confusion. Men broke and ran only to find themselves in dead-end ravines, where Hawk could deal with them. Finally, only Cain and 3 of his most hardened men remained huddled behind their horses. Cain's face was purple with rage and disbelief. This was impossible. How could one man and a runaway woman do this? Blackwood! He roared, his voice echoing through the canyon. I know who you are. The half-breed bounty man. I'll double whatever she's paying you. Triple it, just give me the woman. From a ledge high above him, Hawk's voice answered, cold and clear as the desert air. She is not for sale, Cain. Everything is for sale, Cain screamed, firing his pistol wildly at the sound of the voice. She is mine. I own her. "You own nothing," the voice replied. Enraged, Cain spurred his horse forward, deeper into the canyon, his remaining men following reluctantly. This was what Hawk had been waiting for. He led them on a chase through a narrow, twisting passage that opened into a small, bowl-shaped clearing. It was a dead end. As Cain and his men entered the clearing, Rosalind, from her position above, pushed a dead, precariously balanced log from the canyon rim. It crashed down, blocking the narrow entrance, trapping them completely. They were in a kill box. Hawk appeared on a ledge opposite Rosalind, his rifle at his shoulder. Cain and his men were caught between them. The three men, seeing the hopelessness of their situation, threw down their guns. They were hired muscle, not fanatics. But Cain was different. His entire world was built on the foundation of his own power. To be defeated, to be caged, was a fate worse than death. He looked up at Hawk, then his eyes swiveled, and found Rosalind standing in the open on the opposite ledge, rifle in her hands. His face contorted into a mask of pure hatred. "You!" He spat, his voice dripping with venom. "You filthy, ungrateful animal! I marked you. I made you. You belong to me in this life or the next." He raised his pistol, not at Hawk, the man who had destroyed his force, but at Rosalind, the possession that had dared to defy him. Two shots rang out so close together, they sounded like one. One was from Cain's pistol. The other was from Hawk's rifle. Cain's shot went wide, kicking up dust on the rocks near Rosalind's feet. Hawk's shot was true. It struck Cain square in the chest, throwing him from his saddle. He landed in the dust with a heavy thud, his reign of terror over. Silence descended upon the canyon, broken only by the mournful whisper of the wind. Rosalind stood on the ledge, her knuckles white on the stock of the rifle, her body trembling not with fear, but with the violent, shuddering release of years of torment. It was over. The echoes of his voice, his rage, his ownership were finally fading, leaving only the quiet hum of her own reclaimed soul. The aftermath in Whisperwind Pass was as quiet as the fight had been loud. After sending Cain's surviving men back to Redemption Creek with news of his demise, Hawk and Rosalind rode west. They traveled for days, leaving the Badlands and their bloody memories behind each, processing the violent conclusion to their ordeal. They finally made camp in a peaceful, isolated valley, sheltered by aspen groves, a world away from the dust and cruelty they had endured. Here, for the first time, they truly rested. The physical wounds began to heal, but the deeper scars remained. One evening as the sun set, Rosalind sat by a clear stream, watching the cool water run over her hands. "Will it ever go away?" she asked quietly, without looking at Hawk as he sat beside her. The feeling of being dirty. The memory of him. Hawk considered her question, his gaze fixed on the water. "No," he said, his honesty a comfort. "It won't. The past is a part of us. It's the trail we've walked. You can't erase your tracks." Her shoulders slumped. "Then I'll never be free." "That's not what I said," he countered, turning to her. "The tracks don't decide where you walk tomorrow. They just show where you've been. Cain tried to break you, but he failed. You fought back." He paused, his grey eyes intense. "That brand on your shoulder, it's not the mark of what he did to you anymore. It's the mark of what you survived. It doesn't mean you belong to him. It means you beat him." Tears streamed down her face, but they weren't tears of shame. They were tears of a painful, profound release. He wasn't promising an easy future, but a possible one. She reached out and took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. It was the first time she had initiated contact, a simple gesture that spoke volumes. The fear was finally losing its hold. "And you, Jacob?" she asked, using his name for the first time. "What about your tracks?" "Maybe I've been waiting for a reason to make a new one," he answered, returning the gentle pressure of her hand. They sat in the fading light as the first stars appeared. No grand promises were made, but a silent understanding passed between them. The future was an uncharted territory, but they would navigate it together. The brand on her skin would never disappear, but its meaning had been reforged in fire and loyalty. It was no longer a symbol of shame, but a permanent reminder of her survival and of the warrior who helped her reclaim her soul under a vast open sky. The tale of Jacob Hawke Blackwood and Rosalind Thorne is more than just a story of revenge. It's a testament to the indomitable will of the human spirit to reclaim itself. It reminds us that our deepest scars do not have to define our future, but can become symbols of the battles we've survived. This story, etched in the dust and rock of the Old West, shows how the most profound acts of bravery aren't always in a gunfight, but in the quiet moments of trust and acceptance that allow a broken soul to heal. Their journey through the canyons of hatred to a valley of peace is a powerful echo from our history, proving that redemption isn't a place you find, but something you build hand in hand with the scars that made you who you are. If this lost tale from the frontier resonated with you, please consider giving this video a like and sharing it with others who appreciate stories of survival and justice. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you won't miss our next journey into the untold stories of the Wild West.